All right, so good evening, ladies and gentlemen and individuals. Thank you for taking the time to listen in. Welcome to Holding Government Accountable, our workshop. Uh, Entering week 9, halfway through. Welcome back from spring break. All right, so a little bit of overview, then we'll jump right in. So this workshop is a series that's focused on how individuals inside and outside of government can hold it accountable to the Constitution, state and federal laws and regulations. This is a series of 16 30-minute workshops during the spring 2020 term, every Wednesday from 7:30 to 8, and the workshops are held via Zoom. For the past 8 weeks, we covered a whole range of topics: student power, local government, semester in Sacramento, RDC, the state capitol, state boards and commissions, the Hill, there's a manual, and congressional oversight of U.S. foreign policy. We took a break for spring break because I believe spring break is for breaks, not for like more work or more things to do. It's time to chill, get a breather, and then come back at it for the rest of the term. So for the rest of the term, we have holding different institution or individuals accountable, starting with the president, and then we'll go to state government and so on and so forth. So with that, I'll go ahead and get us to that part of the presentation. I'll go ahead and share my slides. Of course, it shows up in the wrong pane. I want to make sure it goes to this one, which should be here. Nope. Not monitor 2, maybe primary monitor, currents from current slide. There we go. All right, so holding the president accountable. Dun, 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 dun. Let's roll. So our learning objectives with this workshop are the following. First is describe how to contact the White House. Secondly is to explain how Congress holds the president accountable. Next is to explain how public can give comments on executive branch regulations. And then lastly, explain how elections allow the public to hold the president directly accountable. So first things first, contacting the White House. Now, as a regular schmo Joe, person who lives in this somewhere in the country, right, you can send a message to the White House. It may or may not get to the president directly, but it'll certainly get to some interns and some staff. And maybe, just maybe, your letter gets in front of the president and they will sign a letter back to you. Now, I know this because I got a letter back from then President Obama. Right now, it's in my office, which I basically haven't sat in since COVID happened over 2 years ago. Once I return, hopefully in the summer, if not the fall, I'll have that letter next time I have this workshop. But contacting the White House is the name of being able to have your voice heard. So you might be saying, how does that happen? Well, let's go to whitehouse.gov and we'll go to the contact page. So whitehouse.gov. So here's the White House site, and we are looking to contact the president. So click on contact us. And here you can have a message for the president, the vice president, need help with an agency, question about the website, request a presidential greeting. And here you put in your information, first name, last name, information, pronouns, phone numbers, address, and what you'd like to say. So if you have a concern about gas prices, you can send a letter to the president. If you have a concern about foreign policy, you can send a letter to the president. If you have a concern about climate change, you can send a letter to the president. If you have a concern about student loans, you can send a letter to the president. The point is that this is here for you to give your input directly to the White House and to the president of the United States. And I strongly encourage it. It's one of the many valves that we have as members of the public to have our voice expressed and hopefully heard. So that's one way you can hold the president accountable. Send him a message. Now, the next thing we can do is see how Congress, a co-equal branch of federal government, can hold the president accountable. So there's 3 ways they do it. The first one is through annual appropriations legislation or bills. Secondly is through congressional oversight hearings. And third is through congressional dear colleague letters. So let's unpack each of these. So when it comes to annual appropriations legislation bills, so let's be clear what these are. Appropriation is a law of Congress that provides an agency with budget authority. An appropriation allows the agency to incur obligations and to make payments from the U.S. Treasury for specified purposes. Appropriations are definite, which is a specific sum of money, or indefinite, which is such sums as may be necessary. Now, Congress passes 12 annual appropriations acts every year, as well as supplemental appropriations acts. These appropriation acts provide budget authority to obligate and expend funds from the U.S. Treasury for specific purposes. The House appropriation is contained in one of 12 acts named the Legislative Branch Appropriations Bill. Now, you're asking, where can we get a little bit more information about the status of appropriations as they are today? We can go, sadly, this page is no longer available, so I have to click on the new link. So the Congressional Research Service is the research arm for the Congress, nonpartisan analysis of legislation and of existing policies. And as we wait for the appropriations status table to load, which is also not loading for some reason, that's peculiar. Let me go to the home page. Really? Well, it was working not too long ago. Appropriations. Let's see if there's a recent report. Huh. And the whole site's down. Well, anyways, the site would show us a table of all the 12 bills, where they're at in the process, and then we would be able to click on them and kind of get more specific information on it. The Congressional Research Service also will have reports on each of the appropriations bills with specifics like what's in the bill, how much is being proposed to spend on existing programs, which programs are being phased out or not funded at levels. And it functionally serves as Congress's check on the president, because the president gets to propose a budget, but the Congress is the one that says, this is how we're gonna, and this is where we want the money spent. So that's another way of holding the president accountable. Next, we have the Congressional Oversight hearing. So for example, the House Armed Services Committee is responsible for what's called the NDAA, or the National Defense Authorization Act. And this is about $750 billion in allocations to the U.S. Armed Forces. Now, this is pre-Russian invasion of Ukraine, so this might go up, not sure. But traditionally or historically or more recent times, it's been about $750 billion a year. Now, the committee itself is one of two committees head of oversight. In the Senate, it's called the Senate Armed Services Committee. Sticking with the House, because that's what I'm more familiar with, that committee has several subcommittees that will oversee parts of the NDAA. So one of those subcommittees is the Subcommittee on Readiness. And the subcommittee will do what's called a subcommittee mark of that bill. And what they basically do is, like, each subcommittee has its kind of territory or its jurisdiction over parts of that bill. And they'll hold hearings on things that they have oversight for. They'll mark up parts of the bill language or the legislation itself, and then they'll send it to a full committee, and then they'll go through a whole very rigorous and arduous process. So I'll go ahead and pull up the press release from the fiscal year 2021 subcommittee markup. And just point out here, so led by Chairman John Garamendi and Ranking Member Doug Lamborn of Colorado, the Committee on Armed Services Subcommittee today released their proposal for fiscal year 2021 NDAA. The subcommittee will meet at 3 p.m. Eastern on Tuesday, June 23rd in Rayburn Building 1, room 112-118. The markup will be live streamed on the committee's website, and it's also available here. And then it goes on to describe what's in this year's proposal. So make investments in key readiness accounts and military infrastructure, continue efforts to address contamination associated with some chemicals, continue efforts to address vulnerability in fuel storages, build on the committee's previous legislative oversight activities to ensure military personnel families live in quality housing, support the Department of Defense civilian workforce, and so on and so forth. So the president, right, commander in chief, there is a Department of Defense that's overseen by a civilian secretary of defense, and then there's the military branch. Well, the Congress, through its power of the purse and through its power of proposing laws, gets to oversee that Department of Defense. And sometimes the directions are like similar, like they're cool with what the president's going and Department of Defense. Most of the time there's some tension somewhere, and the Congress is going to exercise its preference on policies or on actions of, in this case, Department of Defense through legislation, in this case, through the National Defense Authorization Act. So that's yet another way the president's held accountable is by the Congress. And then here's a picture of the chairman and the ranking member. And the reason I use this example is because I used to work for Congressman John Garamendi way back in the day. Great times, difficult times, but it was a lot of fun. I learned a lot. I appreciated the opportunity. And this is a link to his press release that he put out on the markup from last year. Now, the last way a president can be held accountable by the Congress is through what's called Dear Colleague letters. So Dear Colleague letters are official correspondence between members of Congress that lawmakers use to gauge or build support or opposition for legislation or other causes. This can be also informative, providing details about House and Senate operations, such as security measures or entrance disclosures. And so let's go and take a look at dearcolleague.us. Interesting. This is also down. Dear Colleague letters. It used to be here. Well, that's disappointing. All right, well, I'll stick with this one. No, that's for an executive branch. Well, go with Wiki. When in doubt, Wiki out. So this webpage goes on to describe some Dear Colleagues. The website I'd link to that is down basically was a repository of Dear Colleague letters. Now, Dear Colleague letters aren't kind of easily publicly available, but if you worked in the Congress as a staff member, like I did many years ago, there's a whole webpage and website that has a catalog of all the Dear Colleague letters that are being sent out by different offices. So it's basically like, imagine like an internal messaging or internal email system. And we called it the Dear Colleague system. It looks like it's still in place or something similar. So I'm bummed that I don't have an example of it because that website's down, but I'll make a note of it and we'll fix it next time we present. In any case, the Congress members will use Dear Colleagues to build support or opposition, and then eventually they'll make it public by sending it to either the president themselves or some executive branch department or agency. So it's like a way of the Congress of signaling through non-legislative means their interests or their preferences on particular policy issues or actions in the executive branch. Okay. So how else can we hold the president accountable? Well, one way of doing it is by having public comments on proposed regulations. So you might be asking, what regulations? I'm like, yes, there are regulations, and you probably heard of them. Some people call it red tape. I don't think about it in a pejorative way. I just say these are the rules of the roads. And there's ways for us as members of the public to engage in that process. So the way to do it is a website called the Federal Register. This is the daily journal of the United States government. And in this journal, you'll have documents from across different executive branch departments and agencies. And they'll include things like notices, presidential documents, proposed rules, and significant documents. So I'll go ahead and open proposed rules, and we'll see what's in the most recent Federal Register. So some proposed rules on the following: Energy Conservation Program, Energy Conservation Standards for automatic commercial ice makers. Okay, interesting. Next one, special conditions for Airbus model A321 Neo XLR plane passenger protection from external fire. Airworthiness directives, the de Havilland Aircraft of Canada Limited, type certificate previously held by Bombardier Inc. airplanes. Another one, Airbus Canada Limited Partnership, Airworthiness Directive, proposed amendment to the VOR, Federal Airway, North Central United States, proposed revocation of a colored Federal Airway Amber 2, and a couple of other things. So I'm going to click on this one here, the approval and promulgation of air quality implementation plans. So I'm going to open this, and I'm going to have the summary read to us because I have a little audio speaker, and I believe my audio is sharing. So hopefully this works. We'll have it read aloud.
The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, is proposing to approve a state implementation plan, SIP, revision, made in 2 separate submittals, by the state of Delaware. This revision removes requirements for gasoline vapor recovery systems installed on gasoline dispensers, the purpose of which are to capture emissions from vehicle refueling operations, otherwise known as Stage 2 vapor recovery. This revision also strengthens Delaware's requirements for gasoline vapor recovery systems that capture emissions from storage tank refueling operations, otherwise known as Stage I vapor recovery. Specifically, this action would remove from the approved SIP prior approved Stage 2 requirements applicable to new and existing gasoline dispensing facilities, GDFs. New and existing GDFs will be required to decommission their Stage 2 vapor recovery systems, VRS, and to install, maintain, and periodically test Stage I enhanced vapor recovery systems, EVRS. Delaware's SIP revision establishes a compliance schedule for these changes and includes a demonstration that removal of Stage 2 requirements is consistent with the Clean Air Act, CAA, and meets all relevant EPA guidance.
So say you were living in the state of Delaware, or you're a clean air advocate, or you're a gasoline retail operator, or you're just a general consumer, and you read this and you say, I have some opinions about this. Well, what you could do is submit rated comments on or before May 6th, so they're included in the record. And there are processes describing how to provide that comment. And you might just want to say, I read the regulation, I'm opposed to it. And some people do that. They're just like, I'm opposed to any regulation. Okay, fine. There's some people who have that kind of strong absolutist view, but there's others who have very nuanced and technical criticisms or suggestions or ideas to kind of improve it or make it more refined as a proposed regulation and eventual regulation. So in this case, you could read the background and purpose about what's going on and what's happening and say, okay, based on my reading of this proposed regulation, I would suggest this, I would say that. You might want to consider this metric or this measurement, or you might want to consider this recent study on the topic. You might want to consider a whole range of different things. So you'd be surprised on the public comments that come through. Some are very like support or oppose without any explanation. Others are very detailed comments and feedback. And the point is that if you want to hold the president accountable, you hold them accountable through the actions that they're asking or mandating be taken by the executive branch agencies or departments that they are ultimately responsible for. So in this case, you give a comment on this proposed rule on the approval and promulgation of air quality implementation plans. And that's your way of saying, I'm trying to hold the president accountable for motivating this kind of proposed rule to begin with their broader policy statements and actions. Okay, so almost to the end. Now, the most common way people think about holding the president accountable is to ask themselves to give or not to give this person a second term, right? That's the question, right? Do I want to reelect or vote for somebody who's running for reelection? Now, just make it clear, right? A president can run for a second 4-year term. This means a president runs for re-election. And because they're running for re-election, this gives the public a direct opportunity to hold the president accountable, right? So in the image you kind of see here on the right, we'll have, it was the closing days of the 2020 presidential election, and then President Trump and then Vice President Biden with Senator Harris were traveling the country building support or finalizing support for their presidential campaigns. Now, when President Trump was barnstorming the country, he was effectively asking the people to give or not to give me a second term, right? And in this case, the people spoke and they said no. And Vice President, now President Biden was elected, and Senator Harris, now Vice President Harris, was elected. This is like the clearest way that us as people, the public in general, can hold the president accountable, is when they ask for re-election, you can say yes, or you can say no. Okay, so with that, you might be asking, well, I have a lot of opinions about the past president, the current president, maybe future presidential candidates. Great, right? Well, let's think about how we go about voting, right? Or the reasoning. So we have what's called prospective voting and retrospective voting. So when someone who's never been president runs for election, voters will typically vote prospectively. And prospective voting is voting based on what the candidate will do once in office, right? You're looking ahead to say, okay, if this candidate says they're going to do X, Y, and Z, I kind of like X, I really like Y, I don't like Z, but overall, good person. I'll go ahead and vote for them. I'm looking forward to seeing how they implement X and Y and maybe how they moderate a little bit on Z. That's prospectively, right? Future forward looking. Now, on the other hand, when a president runs for re-election, voters can both retrospectively vote and prospectively vote. What does that mean? Is retrospective voting is based on the record that the incumbent has created during their first term. So when we have holding the president accountable, we get to both prospectively vote. In other words, what are you saying you're going to do in your second term, future looking? But then you can also say, what did you do in your first term? And how do I feel? How does that impact me? How does it impact the communities that I'm a part of? And now you have a more nuanced approach to holding the president accountable. So with all that said, just want to summarize by saying holding the president accountable doesn't just happen at election time. There are multiple ways and mechanisms by which to do it, both directly, such as contacting the White House through its form, through members of Congress and the Congress itself, through you or interest groups that you're involved with in commenting on regulations, and obviously at the ballot box when election time comes around. So with that, I hope this was engaging and informative. Thanks for listening in. Take care, and I hope to see you next time.